Have you ever stopped to think about how a simple innovation can change the course of history? For nearly 1,000 years, medieval Europe was the stage for an arms race, where the difference between life and death came down to who had the better weapon in their hands. What's fascinating is that these innovations didn't come from great laboratories, but from the skilled hands of blacksmiths and warriors who faced life or death problems every single day. Today, we're going to explore 5 weapons that didn't just change warfare, but redefined medieval society itself. Each one represents a brilliant solution to a specific military problem, telling the story of one of humanity's most fascinating arms races. The crossbow, democratizing death. Imagine you're a peasant in 1100 called to war. On the other side are knights who've trained since childhood, using weapons that cost more than you'd earn in a lifetime. Impossible situation, right? The medieval crossbow solved exactly this problem, forever changing the balance of power in Europe. While it wasn't a medieval invention, the Chinese had been using it for 2,000 years. It was in 11th and 12th century Europe that it transformed any common person into a lethal threat to the most trained military elite. Think about the genius of the design. A regular bow requires years of training, specific muscles, instinctive aim, decades of practice. The crossbow could be mastered by anyone in days. The mechanism did all the heavy lifting. You loaded the bolt, pulled the string, aimed, and fired. It was like having a primitive firearm, the real game changer. Bolts that could pierce any armor of the time. Knights in gleaming armor representing decades of training and fortunes and equipment suddenly became vulnerable to any common soldier. During the Third Crusade, Richard the Lionheart was mortally wounded by a bolt fired by a simple French soldier. Here was the King of England, one of Christendom's most skilled knights, brought down by a common man. The impact was so significant that the Church tried to intervene. The Second Lateran Council in 1139 banned crossbows against Christians, calling them hateful to God. The irony, they could be used against infidels. In practice, this ban was ignored. Crossbows were simply too effective. The crossbow transformed military architecture. Castles gained specific crossbow loopholes and thicker walls. But the most profound impact was social. It democratized violence in a way the aristocracy had never experienced. Noble birth and decades of training could be neutralized by a peasant with weeks of practice. This forced changes throughout the feudal system. Lords had to rethink military strategies and recognize that their dominance was no longer guaranteed. The sword, evolution of lethal elegance. If the crossbow democratized war, the medieval sword elevated it to an art. The sword's evolution represents one of history's most sophisticated races between offensive and defensive technology. When we think of medieval swords, we picture Hollywood's massive weapons. Reality is more fascinating. The medieval sword was a precision tool, the result of centuries of technical refinement. In early medieval times, swords were simple, broad blades, rounded points designed for cutting, effective against leather or simple mail. But when plate armor emerged in the 14th century, cutting became useless. The solution? Narrow swords with sharp points designed to find joints in armor. Medieval blacksmiths weren't just craftsmen. They were engineers solving problems of physics and metallurgy. They created blades with different geometries, some for cutting, others for thrusting. An elegant innovation was the longsword. It could be used with 1 or 2 hands. 1 hand, speed and mobility. 2 hands, power and control. 2 weapons in one. The true genius lay in details. Weight distribution, for example. A well-balanced sword wasn't heavy at the tip. Weight was distributed so the blade moved like a natural extension of the arm. The manufacturing process was almost alchemical. Smiths used pattern welding, soldering different types of iron in specific patterns to create stronger, more flexible blades. A 13th century knight's sword wasn't just a weapon. It was a status symbol, work of art, precision tool, and religious object. Many had sacred relics in the hilt or inscriptions on the blade. At Agincourt in 1415, when French knights were brought down in the mud by English archers, the final phase was decided by highly specialized swords designed to penetrate plate armor. Swords changed the nature of medieval combat, transforming brutal confrontations into something closer to a deadly dance. Fencing schools emerged across Europe. Masters developed complex systems of techniques still studied today. The sword became the definitive symbol of chivalry. Knighting ceremonies always included sword blessing. Oaths were sworn upon them. They became part of medieval aristocratic identity. But perhaps most impressive is how the sword influenced metallurgy. Demand for better blades drove innovations in furnaces and steel treatment, benefiting other areas of medieval technology. The longbow, the English death machine. If you want to understand how a weapon can change European geopolitics, you need to know the story of the English longbow. This is how a relatively small people dominated battlefields for over a century. The longbow wasn't invented by the English. Similar bows had been used in Wales for centuries. But it was in English hands that it became a transformative force. To understand the impact, compare it to the crossbow. Crossbow, slow to reload, heavy, limited range. An experienced crossbowman could fire 2 or 3 bolts per minute. An experienced longbow archer could fire 12 arrows per minute, with deadly accuracy up to 300 meters. This wasn't incremental improvement. It was complete revolution in firepower. But creating a longbow archer took a lifetime. Not years of training, decades of extreme physical conditioning. Archaeologists identify archers' skeletons by specific deformities in arms and shoulders, result of decades pulling 80 to 120-pound bows. The English did something extraordinary. They transformed archer training into a national institution. Laws required men to practice regularly. Competitions happened in every village. The longbow became part of English culture. Crécy, 1346. On the French side, the flower of European chivalry. Hundreds of heavy knights representing decades of training and fortunes. On the English side, 5,000 men, including 3,000 archers. The result changed warfare forever. Charge after French charge was decimated. It wasn't defeat, it was massacre. French aristocracy lost almost a generation in hours. The archers weren't shooting randomly. They used sophisticated tactics. Massed, concentrated fire, creating clouds of death. Selective shooting, targeting horses, or armor gaps. The psychological impact was devastating. Imagine being a knight at Poitiers in 1356. You've trained your whole life for hand-to-hand combat, and you're being killed by men you can't even reach. The consequences were profound. France had to completely rethink its military strategy. The very concept of heavy cavalry as the dominant battlefield force was questioned. The economic impact was also revolutionary. Maintaining knights was extremely expensive. Archers were relatively cheap. The longbow democratized warfare like no previous weapon. The irony: the weapon that made the English powerful planted the seeds of its own obsolescence. It was so effective it accelerated development of other technologies. Castillon in 1453 marked the end of the longbow era, defeated not by knights but by French cannons. The mace. Brutal simplicity. In a world of sophisticated weapons, the mace represents something different. Brutal application of physics to the problem of breaking armor. But don't be fooled by the apparent simplicity. The mace was one of the smartest responses to medieval armor development. In the 13th century, plate armor was becoming sophisticated. Knights became medieval tanks, practically invulnerable to cuts and thrusts. Imagine facing a fully armored knight. Your sword slides off the armor. Your lance might find a joint, but chances are slim. Arrows bounce off. You need a different solution. The mace's genius wasn't in penetrating armor, but in ignoring it completely. brute force applied through a shaft, concentrated in a small, heavy head. Even if armor absorbed impact, force was still transmitted to the body. A mace blow could break bones, cause concussions, or knock out without penetrating armor. It was a scientific warhammer. Kings and princes often preferred ornate maces. There was practical reason. Against armored opponents, the mace was more effective than a sword. And symbolic reason, it represented authority and direct power. Mace evolution is fascinating. First versions, wooden shaft with iron head. As armor improved, maces evolved. Flanged maces emerged with projections to concentrate impact. Then spiked maces to pierce while crushing. The cavalry war mace was especially devastating, designed for mounted use with short shafts and heavy heads. A knight in full charge could crush through enemy formations. The mace changed combat dynamics. No matter how good your armor, you were vulnerable to blunt trauma. This forced changes in armor design, emphasizing impact distribution. The mace also democratized anti-armor combat. While an effective sword required years of training, a mace could be used by anyone with sufficient strength. At Nicopolis in 1396, French and Hungarian crusader knights were killed not by arrows or lances, but by Turkish soldiers using maces. The armor meant to protect them became irrelevant. The poleaxe, the ultimate weapon. If you had to choose one weapon that best represents medieval warfare evolution, it would be the poleaxe. This weapon combines all the advances we've discussed: ability to pierce armor, force to crush defenses, reach to maintain distance, and versatility for multiple threats. The poleaxe was the result of centuries of evolution, each version responding to new challenges. In its mature 15th century form, it represented perhaps the pinnacle of medieval bladed weapon technology. Imagine a medieval soldier's problems: being effective against mounted knights and armored infantry, functioning in formations and individual combat, facing different armors and tactics. The poleaxe solved everything with brutal elegance. The axe blade could cut through light armor or cause trauma. Through heavy armor, the point could pierce joints or serve as a spear against cavalry. The hook could topple knights or pull shields. The real difference: 2-meter reach kept opponents at safe distance while allowing devastating force. It was spear, axe, and warhammer in one weapon. Tactical versatility was impressive. In formation, soldiers created impenetrable walls of points. Against cavalry, they used points to bring down horses and axes to finish fallen knights. In individual combat, techniques were almost infinite. Development showed medieval armament industry sophistication. These weren't simple weapons. They required specialized smiths capable of working different metals and welding them in complex configurations. Different regions developed variations. The Swiss halberd was optimized for dense formations. The English bill favored maximum versatility. The French guisarme emphasized cutting power. Nancy, in 1477, demonstrated devastating power. The Swiss, armed with halberds, shattered Charles the Bold's Burgundian army. Swiss discipline combined with halberds created a military force that would dominate Europe for decades. But perhaps the most fascinating example of how mastering the poleaxe could transform someone's life comes from an unlikely source: an English archer named John Hawkwood. This man started as a common soldier in the 100 Years' War and ended up becoming the most famous military commander in Italy, all because he understood how to use poleaxe formations better than anyone else. Hawkwood arrived in Italy in the 1360s as part of a disbanded English mercenary company. The Italians looked down on these barbarian northerners, but they were about to get a brutal education in English military efficiency. While Italian warfare had become ritualized and relatively bloodless, Hawkwood brought English practicality to the battlefield. The key was his innovative use of dismounted men-at-arms with poleaxes, a tactic virtually unknown in Italy. Italian knights were used to elaborate mounted charges and formal duels. Hawkwood's men would dismount, form tight formations with their poleaxes, and systematically destroy traditional Italian cavalry. The results were almost comical from the Italian perspective. Here was this foreign upstart teaching them how warfare should actually be conducted. Hawkwood's reputation grew so fearsome that Italian city-states began paying him just to stay away. He became known as Giovanni Acuto, Sharp John, and accumulated a fortune that would make modern billionaires jealous. The ultimate irony? When Hawkwood died in 1394, the sophisticated Florentines gave him a state funeral and commissioned a massive fresco in their cathedral. A common English soldier had become so respected that one of Europe's most cultured cities honored him as a hero, all because he knew how to use a poleaxe better than anyone else. The poleaxe broke mounted aristocracy's dominance and elevated infantry status. It was no longer necessary to be rich enough to maintain a war horse to be militarily relevant. As Hawkwood proved, skill with the right weapon could take you from peasant to prince. But the irony, the poleaxe was so effective it accelerated its own obsolescence. Infantry formations with poleaxes were so powerful they encouraged firearm development as the only way to overcome them. Human ingenuity in action. Looking back at this journey through medieval weapons, we see something deeper than military aspects, an extraordinary demonstration of human capacity to innovate under pressure. Each weapon represents someone, a blacksmith, a soldier, an inventor whose name we've lost, looking at a problem and finding a brilliant solution. The crossbow democratized war. The sword elevated it to art. The longbow transformed it into science. The mace reduced it to pure physics. The poleaxe perfected it into engineering. Each innovation created new problems requiring new solutions. It was an evolutionary dance lasting centuries. The crossbow forced armor improvements, which demanded more specialized weapons. The longbow led to new tactics, creating need for new weapons. What we see is humanity's story itself, our capacity to adapt, improve, respond to challenges with creativity. These medieval smiths didn't have computers or sophisticated laboratories. They had only their minds, their hands, and desperate need to solve life or death problems, and they did it brilliantly. Each weapon embodies principles of engineering, physics, and psychology valid today. The crossbow anticipated firearm principles. The sword demonstrated the importance of balance. The longbow showed the power of precision. The mace proved simplicity can be the best solution. The poleaxe demonstrated that versatility beats specialization. These lessons extend beyond warfare. They show that innovation comes from constant improvements, that the best designs combine simplicity with sophistication, that fully understanding your problem is halfway to solving it. Today, facing climate change, disease, poverty, we can learn from these medieval innovators. They show that no matter how impossible a problem seems, there's always an approach. It may require creativity, persistence, a completely new perspective. The medieval arms race eventually ended, replaced by new technologies, but the spirit of innovation it represented, the refusal to accept unsolvable problems, the determination to find better ways, that spirit lives in every current innovation. These fight weapons didn't just change warfare, they changed the world. And the minds that created them continue to inspire us to find our own solutions to the challenges we face.